Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Felix and I absolutely love listening to audiobooks. I have listened to several hundred of them, maybe close to 1,000. And on this channel, I will attempt to review a few audiobooks, talk about them, say what I liked, what I didn't like, and give them a rating. And in the end, maybe recommend a good book or two to you and just have fun with you. The first book I would like to talk to you about is called Imposter Syndrome. It's written by Kathy Wang, read by Lauren Fortgang, and was published by Harper Audio. Firstly, let's talk about the book itself. The book follows three characters. The first is named Leo Guskov, and he's a Russian man, and he's involved with the State Protection Bureau called the SPB, which is basically the Russian version of the CIA in this book. Leo is trying to recruit new assets to work for the SPB, and he goes to university and meets a woman whom he has met before. Her name is Julia, and they met when she was a small child, while Leo was recruiting for boys in what's essentially an orphanage. Even though Leo didn't pick Julia then, because, as I said, he was interested in recruiting boys, she made a lasting impression on him because she was quick on her feet, she was able to speak English a little bit, and she had drive and bravery, and that's what Leo appreciated about her. This is what makes him remember her several years later. Leo then approaches Julia to become an asset in Silicon Valley. Her assignment would be to become a plant in the rising tech industry and hopefully be able to spy for Russia in the future. Julia agrees, and she's set up by the SPB to create a startup company and make a name for herself. She gets a product which the SPB steals from a competitor, and Julia starts working on her assignment. After a 12-year time jump, Julia is now a star in the tech business, and she's the CEO of a billion-dollar company that's called Tangerine. It's like a communications company, which I just imagined as Facebook in my head, and the company has I think 2 billion active users every day. That means Julia is the second highest person in the company after the CEO. And she's just got married. She takes her husband's name, is now called Julia Lerner, which is new to us because she didn't make her last name Lone before. So she didn't have a last name essentially. And she now has a baby on the way. Now that she's established and very successful, Leo, her handler, starts asking more from her. And he wants her to spy deeper. And he asks her to basically provide profile data and user data and location for specific people, like, for example, congressmen, other famous businessmen, people that might be important to the intelligence community. And while Julia initially tries to refuse, her resistance is kind of weak, and she starts doing basically immediately what Leo asks of her and uses a tool that's called God Mode, which gives her basically complete access to absolutely everything aside from the data of the company's CEO and herself, which she has anyways. Tangerine, so the company that's basically Facebook, once got into public trouble because they used God Mode and it's not supposed to exist anymore. They promised the public they would switch it off, but they didn't. 6 months later, we meet the third main character of the book, and her name is Alice Liu. Alice is a fairly low-level service technician at Tangerine, and she does a routine checkup on a server and notices some unusual data traffic. And she is a bit skeptical at first if she's even allowed to do so, which we later find out she isn't. She's not even authorized to do server checks like this. She does it anyways and figures out somebody's using God Mode. And immediately she's absolutely terrified because A, she knows God Mode is illegal and it's not supposed to exist. And B, she fears that the user of God Mode, who's obviously very, very powerful, figures out that Alice knows about this and terminates her, basically. And since Alice is a regular employee, she needs the income, so this is quite a danger to her. And Alice almost immediately figures out that the person using God Mode is Julia, and is even more terrified because, as I said, Julia is the second highest person in this company. Julia, being very smart and a bit paranoid, also finds out something herself. By noticing that her recent searches includes a name that she didn't recognize, she figures out that somebody has been in her God Mode account, which is Alice. And Julia doesn't take long to figure that out. Leo, meanwhile, asks more and more from Julia. Aside from the God mode data breach, he also wants to install a backdoor into Tangerine so the SPB can siphon off data directly, and Julia is not really okay with that. And in fact, she actually goes against Leo's wishes while telling Leo, yes, we're working on that. She's telling the company about the exploit they're trying to do and basically attempts to stop that from happening. Julia, being afraid for her position and safety, starts going against Leo's wishes. And meanwhile, Alice is getting closer and closer to Julia, and she's getting less and less comfortable with Julia using God mode. But that doesn't stop Alice from using God mode herself on someone from her past in order to ruin his life for something this person did to her mother. If you're curious about the rest of the book, you'll have to read it for yourself. I'm not going to spoil this here. If you absolutely insist on this, we can talk about this in the comments, but I wouldn't recommend this for people who haven't read the book. Now, let's move on to the critique. The book itself is nothing special. I'm sorry, I have to be honest. We have a saying in German that would call this book nothing half, nothing full, meaning it's a bit half-hearted, it doesn't deliver, it's a bit short of on expectations. And I say this because this book is kind of generally marketed as, on the one hand, a spy thriller, and on the other hand, a satire of the life in Silicon Valley. But it's neither. It's not thrilling because the highest stakes in the book would be Julia being outed as a Russian spy. And Leo actually tries several times to scare her with that. But in the whole book, this just doesn't seem tangible. The actual danger to Julia doesn't really seem possible. It's not coming across to the reader as Julia will be found out imminently. And on the other hand, the second highest stakes in the book are that Alice loses her job, which is not that thrilling, to be honest. This just isn't particularly gripping, considered this is supposed to be a spy thriller. On the other hand, the book is supposed to be satire, but it's not really that either, because satire includes exaggerating aspects of the thing you're trying to make fun of, per definition. But if anything, all the descriptions of Julia and her lavish lifestyle and what she does to be in her position and stay in power actually seems incredibly realistic. So I don't know where the exaggeration of this would be. But to be fair, I've never worked in the US or in Silicon Valley, so I wouldn't 100% know about this. I just can't imagine this is entirely exaggerated. Another downfall of the book to me is the character of Leo. He's a point of view character in the book, and he is quite important to the story, being the handler for Julia. And he's supposed to be the one who initiates the drama for Julia, the higher stakes. But he doesn't really do much. He basically only exists to try to heighten Julia's danger. But that doesn't really work, as I've mentioned already, because you just don't start to fear for Julia. She seems like she has it under control, and even if she's being found out, it's not like they were, for example, in the Cold War and she would be shot or something. It's just the book plays, I think, in 2008, so the worst that could happen is some jail time. Leo actually gets a small subplot that includes a crisis of conscience, because he figures out what the information he gives to the SPB can lead to in the real world. And building from that crisis of conscience, he gets a health scare. And building from that health scare, he gets a blossoming romance with someone. But that ultimately goes absolutely nowhere, so I'm not sure where this is included in the book. Yeah, this is one of the sad things about this book. It's kind of falling short on expectations, or possibilities, let's say. I have the feeling that the Leo chapters were only added to pad the book, which is kind of sad, because I will get to this later, but Leo could be an incredibly interesting character, actually. But that doesn't mean the book is terrible. You know, Julia's character and initial plot are quite interesting because she's much more awful than it seems that she's on the outside. And it's interesting, just not thrilling, to see what she gets up to later in the book. The end actually also manages to be thrilling for about 5 minutes, but that doesn't last long. It's also interesting to you about the actual spying stuff Leo does in the one chapter where he actually does the spying stuff himself, and he uses an asset called Trisha to blackmail an engineer, which is actually written quite interestingly. The book in my opinion, could have been vastly improved with more of this particular spying aspect, because Leo seems competent and in charge instead of argumentative, because basically all the interactions with him and Julia are just arguing. The next thing I would like to talk to you about is the characters of the book. They are quite a mixed bag. For example, they range from idiotic and shallow and poorly written, like the company's or Tangerine CEO Pierre, to forgettable, like Alice's roommate and cousin Sherry, to actually interesting, first and foremost being, of course, Julia herself. Julia is particularly interesting to me because she radiates this perfect aura. And in the media, she's trying her hardest to basically be portrayed as like a Steve Jobs type, to be a super business genius, who's very competent in everything she does. And she's portraying herself to be this fighter for women's rights, for example. And she's basically trying to achieve the perfect image as the businesswoman who's also a great wife and mother. But under the surface, she's incredibly competitive. She's cunning and ruthless. For example, she publicly calls out other companies, saying they need to be more women in the managing positions and on the boards, while actually in Tangerine actively sabotaging other females so they don't threaten her role in the company. For example, she will start rumors about them or try to get them fired or something, and stop them trying to climb the corporate ladder. She even sabotages another SPB asset because she fears that this person, I think his name is Alex, will gain recognition from the SPB instead of her. Her position, her wealth, and especially her power are most important to her, and she actually feels kind of entitled to all this, because we need to remember that she did work to get to where she is. But Julia seems to forget that the SPB set her up to basically not start from zero. It's much easier to climb to the top from the middle than from the bottom. And Julia doesn't seem to remember that she didn't start at the bottom, but rather in the middle somewhere. She also sees herself superior to basically everybody, including her husband. And she's pretty much only married to him because it looks better. A great scene I actually really enjoyed with Julia is when she realizes that she's not in the position of power. Because during the birth of her daughter, Julia was completely unprepared of the pain, and she didn't think it would be that bad. So she hadn't made an appointment with an anesthesiologist to prepare like an epidural or something, and she realizes mid-birth that she needs one. And the doctor is being very slow, and he's not quite performing on the level that Julia would want to, and it's taking too long. And then she's internally begging him to give her what he has, which is the power in the situation. And I think that's very much showing to how Julia is, because in this situation, everybody would think of either the pain or their child, or start, for example, cursing their husband. But Julia's thinking about power in this situation, which is quite interesting, and to me is Julia in a nutshell. Sadly, I don't think the author meant to give this much power or this much attention to this scene, because it's like 3 sentences long, which is kind of sad. I just interpret it this way. Leo is severely undeveloped. He's a seasoned and experienced spy with a crisis of conscience, which actually would be great stuff for a novel, but it's not being used. This is basically not used in the book at all. I mentioned this one scene, and that's pretty much it, aside from the very beginning of the book where he talks to somebody else about his hiring practices, but that's also just throwaway lines. Especially because Leo's involvement in the situation where he gets the crisis of conscience from could be fantastic. I don't want to spoil this because it's actually quite important for Leo's character. But basically, he gives information to the SPB. The SPB acts on this information, and Leo realizes and feels terrible. This is the most spoiler-free I can keep this. It's not quite Leo's fault in this case, because it wouldn't be my fault if I tell somebody there's a bank on the corner and this person goes like, okay, thanks, and goes to rob it. That's also not my fault, but I understand why Leo would feel this way in this situation. The most saddening thing about this story is that it's basically fading away into the background the further the book goes on. The author just seems to forget about the story in the end. And to me, the most relatable character in the book is Alice. Alice struggles with the daily life as a low employee. She gets dumped by her boyfriend, and her fear of losing her job is what makes her very human, because it's a spy thriller. We're not usually able to feel with the characters in this book because we're not living through the situation. But I think everyone has feared of losing their job in the past. She also gives into the temptation of using God mode. And she is quite flawed because she's a human being. And if given the power and this temptation, it's really understandable that she would use it. And she gives into this temptation with her reasoning seeming at best unnecessary and at worst petty, but it's still entirely relatable. And aside from her abuse of God mode, she almost always makes the correct decisions. For example, when she realizes she's in over her head, she's trying to get help, which is very important. And probably my favorite scene of Alice's is when she goes to this lavish party that her roommate, which is also her cousin, gets her into as her +1. It's the kind of party that Julia would go to, like the multi-millionaire rich people party. And then on contrast, we have Alice, who's just like a regular person. And Alice tries her best to approach an important person who used to work at Tangerine to help out with the Julia situation. But she fails miserably, eats a whole bunch, way more than she should, gets drunk, and then takes a bunch of drugs and starts acting completely inappropriately, which is one of my favorite scenes in the book because it's actually quite funny and it basically humanizes Alice even more, which is a nice trait to have. And at the end of the party, she just blacks out and wakes up at home. The book has a few more POV characters, like point of view characters, who basically tell the story, but none of them are as important as these three, and some of them only get like 1 or maybe 2 chapters. Now, let's get into the audiobook itself, starting with the acting. The actress, we have to be fair, she's doing her very best with the material. The thing is that the story doesn't really give her much opportunity to show off her range at all. The dialogue is almost always like simply spoken. There's no, or basically no like crying, for example, or like extreme danger where you would have to shout or like rage or something. It's like I'm talking to you right now, basically regular dialogue. So not much opportunity to act. But a good actor can turn a mediocre book into a great book, or at least into a good book. But this sadly doesn't apply here. Not because Lauren Fortgang isn't capable of that, but because this isn't a good book to start with. I'm sorry, but if you like this book, I'm sorry, I just don't. But Fortgang's performance is passable. It's fine. It's no stumbles, no weird character choices. She just delivers a passable performance. It's enough to secure her paycheck and enough to get her another gig, but it's not going to win her any awards. One of the things that can make or break a book, especially with many characters, which this one doesn't have, this is like a good to slightly low character count, but that's nothing bad. There are terrific books that have like 2 or 3 characters. Fortgang tries to go for like a high class, maybe slightly arrogant or snobbish Julia, which is perfectly fitting. But what's not fitting is that Julia doesn't have an accent at all. Julia is Russian and she lives in the United States. And I kind of have to demerit something because it is specifically mentioned in the book by Leo that Julia would likely never entirely use her Russian accent. But in the book, she has none at all, which is a missed opportunity. But again, to be fair to Fortgang, the producer and the director of the book would probably have made that decision for her, so this isn't entirely her fault. Fortgang also performs Leo without an accent, but this makes much more sense, and in this case I will defend this because Leo is much older than Julia and has much more time to actually practice his English, and second, it's indicated that language is really important to him, so he would be the kind of guy who would put in the effort to actually lose his accent. Otherwise, Fortgang basically voices Leo as like a pitched down version of Julia, which is okay, not quite as arrogant, but in the same style, basically. And the only person because I just talked about accent, who doesn't have an accent at all, basically, is Alice's mother. Alice is Chinese American, and her mother is, I think Alice herself is born in Beijing as well, and so her mother has a Chinese accent, which isn't great. I would generally describe it as vaguely Chinese accent. Fortgang isn't doing a terribly good job, but it's also not a bad job. If you would hear the accent, you would know this is meant to be Chinese. Fortgang narrates Alice as more relaxed and less high-strung than Julia, which makes sense, but fails to deliver Alice's emotion in important scenes. For example, Alice is usually much more scared. The surprise and wonder, for example, when she finds out God mode is actually still intact, just doesn't carry, really. And also, when Alice figures out that Julia knows that Alice is the one using God mode next to her, also doesn't really match. Alice would be like completely terrified, but Fortgang reads it as slightly scared, which is a bit of a mixed bag, as I said before. But there are scenes where Julia and Alice meet, and it's basically this women's meeting at Tangerine, which Julia organizes to keep up the facade of being interested for women in the workplace and trying to advance them, while in reality keeping them small. And you can distinguish the characters. When multiple women are talking, you do realize it's not always the same woman, but the separation could be better. If the book wouldn't make it clear who's speaking, it would be kind of hard to distinguish the voices, but the book itself helps in this case. The best performance is very curious, probably to most of you, or the like 3 people who are watching this. It's for the most unimportant of side characters. It's this bratty little boy called Oliver, and he's a customer at Alice's mother's noodle stand. And he's like this kid who's just stubborn and he wants the noodles. And his mother said, no, it's too spicy. You can have the noodles. And Fortgang really pictures this boy, or portrays this boy incredibly well. You can just picture this kid being this whiny little bugger who will not accept no and starts whining. And Fortgang does great with him. Sadly, he has like 3 lines in the whole book and he never appears again. The next part I would like to mention is the production. Going forward, most audiobooks will have perfect scores in production. There are no cutting mistakes in this one. There are no botched words, no rereads. The audio is mixed quite well. You can always hear them. And this is, again, what I just said, why production will almost always have 5 points, as in this case. But the time will come where this won't happen. I have listened to audiobooks with terrible cutting mistakes. So just so you know, this will happen in the future. Just expect 5. I will mention it if it's not 5 points. Just so you guys know, I always listen to audiobooks on 1.15 times the speed, so 15% faster. This just helps me go through the book a bit quicker while taking nothing away from the actual voice performance. This will usually not influence the book's rating going forward. What I mean by this is sometimes a book is read so slowly that even at 1.15 times the speed, it still seems slow. Then I will talk about this and then I will deduct points, but this isn't the case here, so just assume that normal speed is also perfectly fine. And just so you know, this is taken into consideration. As I said, in this case, I won't deduct any points, but I do like to listen a bit faster. And it's not the book's fault, since this is my choice. The next point of scoring is attention retention. And what do I mean by this? This could also be called engagement, but I think this way of putting this is actually better, because I'm not sure if this goes for everyone, this just goes for me. I always kind of want to drift off with my thoughts. And a good book, and more importantly, a great book, and a good actor will fight this impulse and drag my thoughts back to the book because it's enticing. So you could, again, call this engagement, but this way is better. Surprisingly, in this case, the attention retention isn't too bad, even though I didn't like the book much and didn't think that much of the performance. But I think in this case, it's kind of to do with that I'm listening more closely for this review. So I will try to not have this influence my rating, but it's not bad in this book. You do get pulled back, let's say that. The next point specifically about the audiobook is that the re-listening chance is basically zero in this case. I found the book uninteresting at best and boring at worst, and the actress can't convince me otherwise either. Again, this isn't her fault because she can only do so much with the given material, but sadly she isn't able to save it. So sadly, I don't think I will be listening to this book again. Lastly, I have some loose thoughts. And a specific point I want to talk about now is the title of the book, because the title is called Imposter Syndrome. And I have no idea why it's called that. I had to look up a definition to make sure that I wasn't just wrong guessing what it means in my head, but I wasn't. So if you're unaware now, here is a definition of the Imposter Syndrome. But there isn't a single important character in this book that fits this description. Julia, if anything, is the complete opposite, and she's overconfident in her abilities and feels like she deserves to be there more than anything else. She seems to forget that she had her big break pretty much handed to her by the SPB. Leo questions his role in the SPB, but it's not because of his capabilities and he feels inadequate or something, but it's rather because of something he did, but not because he doesn't feel he deserves it. And Alice fears for her job all the time, yeah, but the reason for that is that she unearthed a big secret, not because she doesn't feel like she's earned it. So this title choice doesn't make much sense to me. And just on a bit of a personal note, I apparently suffer from imposter syndrome, at least unconsciously a bit, because to this day I still have regular dreams about my master's degree, and I dream that someone comes to me and says, you have to take this exam again or we will take away your degree, which I wake up and then go, whoa, what the hell? But just a loose anecdote I thought you would maybe find interesting. Forgive me, everybody, for the next section I will have my baby on my lap, slightly off camera. Let's come to the overall score of this book. For the story, I'm sorry to say this book can't get more than 5 points out of 10. The bare bones ideas are there, but they're stretched a little bit too thinly, and some of them got forgotten at the end of the book. The acting gets 5 points out of 10 as well. Fortgang isn't bad, but she's not good either. The production gets 10 points, as I mentioned before, as most of the books will going forward. The attention retention I would usually give 7 points to, because I found myself to listen fairly closely. But I think this is because of the review, so I'm deducting 1 point to make it fair, making it 6 out of 10. Applying the weighted scoring, which I will make a separate video about, this will give this book a 5.65 score out of 10, which means it gets a recommendation of fine if you have nothing else. If you want to read it on a plane, for example, it's perfectly fine. You're not going to fall asleep during it, but don't expect that much from it. If you have other books you would like to read before that, go ahead. This one can stay on the shelf for a while and you won't miss anything. So, we made it through a first review. Thank you so much for watching. If you're one of the 5 people who watched this, I am currently working on more reviews. I'm actually trying to pre-produce a few videos so they can all go up on the same time and give me some time to work on the next one after that. I do have a small baby at home, so I can't promise anything regular, but I will try to my hardest to at least semi-regularly upload content. And please be patient with me. This is my first time editing a video for anyone else but me, so if it's terrible, just give me time. I promise it will get better at some point. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day. Bye.